Now we learn how to define classes and then to create objects from the class definition. So after we created objects from the class definition, we need to work with these objects. When a method uses the self parameter to create an attribute, the attribute belongs to the specific object that the self references. So we call these attributes instance attributes because they belong to a specific instance of the class. It is possible to create many instances of the same class in the program, and each instance will then have its own set of attributes. For example, the car objects. From the car class definition, we can create as many car objects as possible, and each car object has its own data attribute values. And this is these are three car objects here, and we can create as many as we want. We talked about data hiding. So hiding attributes is basically to make these data attributes private. And to make sure these data attributes are private, when we name these data attributes, we use the prefix double underscore in the attribute's name. And then a private data attribute cannot be directly accessed via dot notation. It can only be accessed via the public methods of the class. So if you try this in your code, you will get an error because you cannot use dot notation to access the double underscore year directly outside the class definition. Because the double underscore year, this data attribute is private. You can only access the double underscore year value or data attribute through the public method getYear. So typically, we want all the class data attributes to be private. However, in order to access these data attributes, we need to provide methods to access or to change these data attributes. And these methods are what we call accessors and mutators. A method that returns a value from a class attribute but does not change it is known as an accessor method. Accessor methods provide a safe way for code outside the class to retrieve the values of the attributes without exposing the attributes in a way that they could be changed by the code outside the method. And a method that stores a value in a data attribute or changes the value of a data attribute in some other way is known as a mutator method. A mutator method can control the way that a class data attributes are modified. So when the code outside the class needs to change the value of the object's data attribute, it typically calls the mutator and it passes the new value as an argument. And if necessary, the mutator can validate the value before it assigns it to the data attribute. So let's take a look at this car example. We know that outside the class definition, for example, inside main, we cannot say a car dot double underscore year. We cannot do that because the double underscore year is private. It cannot be accessed outside the class definition. However, in order to get the year information, we can call this method getYear. This is a accessor. And this getYear method will return me self dot double underscore year. So basically it will return me the year value for a car. And also we can call the setYear method. SetYear method is a mutator which passes a value which is a year, and this is used to set the new value of the double underscore year data attribute. So this is a mutator that changes this a car object's double underscore year data attributes value. So we also call this accessor a getter and mutator a setter. And through these two methods, we can access or change, even change the data attribute of an object, although these data attributes are private. So if you want, in this setter method, you can also write more code here to validate this year is valid before you set the data attributes. So this provides a line of defense to prevent data corruption. And we learned about methods and functions. We know that we can pass parameters in between methods and functions. We can also pass objects as a parameter in between the functions. So when you are developing applications that work with objects, we often need to write these functions and methods that accept objects as arguments. When you pass an object as an argument, you're actually passing the reference to the object. You're not passing the object data itself, you're passing a reference to the object. And the receiving method or the function that gets this object reference from the parameter list will have access to the actual object through this reference. So what you passed in is not a copy of the data. It's a reference to the actual data. And the receiving method or function will then be able to use this reference to access the object data directly. So the methods of the object can be called within the receiving function or method, and the data attribute may be changed using the mutator methods. Let's take a look at example of this car example. In the main function, I created a car first, and then this car is now black. So when I print it out, is black. Okay. Now I call this method here paint blue and pass in a car. This paint blue is a definition, is a function definition is here, which receive this a car object as a parameter. So this car object, so both this car object and a car object are now referencing the same object. So this is just a reference you pass to this car object. So both these two are referencing the same object. And that object is black, Audi, and A6. So inside the paint blue function, car object dot set color method is called. So which will set the color of this current object. So this car object's color is now set to blue. Okay. And then the call returns back to where it's called. So the control of the flow of the logic comes back to this line of code, and then we execute this line of code. When we execute this line of code, when we get color from a car, now a car is a blue car because it has been changed here. Okay, so a car is passed as an argument to the paint blue function, but a car and car object point to the same object. Changing the color attribute of the car object inside the paint blue function will also affect a car. String method. String method is very common in all the object-oriented programming languages. In Python, the string function has its own specific format, which is the double underscore, str, and double underscore. So the reason we want to have string method is because very often we need to display a message that indicates an object's state. An object state is simply the values of the object's attributes at any given moment. And the string function will be able to be called automatically when when we use this function, print function or string function, and pass in an object to these functions. So when we pass an object to print or pass an object to cast a string, what it will be casted will be dependent on what is the implementation of the string method. So let's take a look at the example. This again, the car class, and in the car class, there's no definition of string function, so there's just a init, and that's the entire car class. So when we create a car object here, and then we printed a car, when we print it, this will be printed out. So if you notice that, it basically tells us it's printed out a car object at this memory location, which is really not very helpful. However, if we change this code to add this string function, double underscore str double underscore, it notice that the string function basically returns a string that defines the current state of the self object, which is the current object's current state. So its current state is defined by the data attribute values of this object. And this will give us more meaningful information about this object. So when we call this print function, pass in a car, now this will be able to print black Audi A6. Because when you do this, the string function will be called behind the scene. So you don't need to call the string function explicitly. It will be called behind the scene when you print an object or when you cast an object to a string. A string function is usually very helpful in debugging. You sometimes change the state of the object in throughout your program. At certain point of your program, you want to know what is the current state, what is the current values of data attributes, so that you have some information to understand whether your program has any problems, any errors, or does it is the object the uh, having the data attribute values that it's supposed to have as this point in your program. So that's very useful in debugging for the um, for with the string function. Okay, so we learned how to write classes, and we know that we can put functions in a module. We can also actually put classes in a module. So if we write a bunch of class definitions, um, we can put the related class definitions all in one file. We call it something.py. And then when we want to use these class definitions, we can simply import the module to the program and then to use the class. For example, this is a file, and in this file, there's a class definition called car. So this file is called cars.py. And in another file or in another piece of code, I want to use the cars. I want to use the car definition here. So I import cars. Notice that I'm importing the module name, not importing the class name. So I'm import cars, and then when I try to create a car object, I need to use the module name first, cars dot car, and this car is the name of this class, so that I can create a new object by using the class definition defined in another module.